Thanks very much, Esther, for the invite to the public lecture. Sure, this is... No, that's not working already. So I'm going to talk for around 10 to 15 minutes on some of my research, some general research from the area. I'm going to give an overview of disordered eating and eating disorders, generally speaking. I'm going to look at why it's perhaps an issue for athletes, more so than other populations. A little look at the general prevalence, what is the extent of the problem, why it might happen in particular sports, and kind of come to some kind of conclusion about what we might be able to do about it, which should then lead nicely on into Andrew's stuff on the applied world and actually working at the coalface with athletes on a day-to-day basis. So the weight of expectation. Why do athletes engage in disordered eating? Let's just have a quick look at what we mean by an eating disorder. When we talk of an eating disorder, we're thinking about a clinical diagnosis, right? So it's of clinical severity. You can see there the American Psychiatric Association, their latest description of that would be a clinically diagnosed behavioural condition characterised by a severe and persistent disturbance in eating behaviours and associated with preoccupations with food, weight or body shape. So emphasis there on persistent disturbance. So this takes place and lasts over a long period of time. The ones that you see there, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder, those are ones that most of you will be familiar with, right? And we're aware of things like anorexia nervosa. We see it in the headlines in newspapers, and these are the things that grab people's attention. Those that actually fall into those clinical categories are actually a fairly small percentage of the population, so it might be around somewhere between 1% and 5% for anorexia nervosa, maybe a little higher for bulimia, but it's not a huge amount of people. And one of the risks of this clinical criteria and the headline anorexia nervosa is that we assume that it's only those diagnoses that are a problem, and it's only those individuals who are at that extreme end who are perhaps suffering or struggling with their eating, and those that are perhaps subclinical or who have more generalised disordered eating, we don't need to worry about them so much, or they're not really our main attention. And I think that's a mistake, particularly in sport where the majority of people will be at the subclinical or disordered eating level. So we shouldn't be fixated on those clinical diagnoses, although they are relevant. And we should kind of adopt this spectrum perspective that most of us will fall into, right? It's the weather's been good. We might have started to think about beaches and our own weight and what we might need to look like in a month or so. Perhaps that's come early this year. So we might have unhealthy weight worries and dieting concerns that might move into actual behaviours where we engage in diets, which could be fad diets, just a strict diet, a crash diet before a holiday, or a crash, if we're talking about sport, a crash diet before an event. And that can go all the way to your clinical eating disorders. If athletes are around here, there still should be a priority for us, right? We shouldn't just focus on those very strict criteria of the well-known eating disorders. So why are super fit, idolised athletes dissatisfied with their bodies? It doesn't necessarily make too much sense, right? We see these people on TV at the Olympics during the year. We're thinking, well, I'd kill for that kind of body. Why would you be dissatisfied with that body? It doesn't make too much sense. Those individuals should have, if anything, a better body image than, say, the general population. There is research to say that's true, right? So some sports and many athletes do have a good body image, and there's some evidence to say that it's a protective factor. Competing in sport protects us against body dissatisfaction and eating disorders. That tends to happen at the kind of competitive or recreational level. Okay? The problems start when we get to that level where individuals are trying to get an extra advantage, or they're at the elite level. So what happens is we have a simple but controllable performance variable that is often overemphasized in sport. So it's the idea that you need to be thin to win, and you adopt that ethos in your training and your eating behaviours. So it's a fairly simple, well, it's not easy, but it's simple, controllable. You know, it's not as demanding as tactics or training regimes. It's just stop eating and you'll see an improvement in performance by being leaner and being able to move around either on the court, on the pitch, or get across your event in a quicker fashion. Okay, so it's a fairly gain an advantage by becoming thin to win. How much of a problem is it? Well, according to some studies, it's twice as common. So it's sort of twice as common in athletic populations than it is in the general population. Women more affected than men, but they're not immune to it. And that might be because athletes don't live in a bubble or a vacuum. They are, susceptible and exposed to the same general society pressures about weight and aesthetics and how we should look. And then you also have your very sport-specific body pressures and physical pressures. We need to take these prevalence figures with a pinch of salt, because obviously there's a great stigma to mental illness and disordered eating. So athletes aren't always likely to come forward and say, well, actually, yeah, I've got an eating disorder, I'm struggling with this, and kind of be open about that. So when we look at prevalence rates, we tend to say that they're probably an underestimate, and it's maybe a bigger issue than we think. Where do we see the risk? Well, it's those sports where weight is a bigger factor, and that's one of the big things of this. It's hard to get away from the fact that weight is a variable. It's a performance variable. You can't deny it, and we can't hide from it, right? Sometimes, if you're carrying less weight, it helps you in your performance. Right, and that's a cold hard fact, and in certain sports that relationship is increased. So things like triathlon and distance events, right, endurance events. If you weigh less and there's less to carry around, it becomes easier. Okay, so those sports are higher risk. There are also sports, aesthetic sports, where perhaps how you look is an unwritten rule. Things like gymnastics and figure skating. And that can have an influence on your disordered eating behaviours. And then lastly there we have weight category sports. So that would be things like judo, boxing, where making a lower weight category puts you at a competitive advantage. Traditionally it was thought that was more of a means end. You kind of got to your weight and then you kind of moved on from that, and you could eat, and you'd adopt regular eating patterns. That happens to some extent, but with the yo-yoing and the crash diets, it can often lead to long-term disordered eating behaviours. So those are the main individuals, but actually who do we miss? Well, a lot of my research has focused on where you might not expect to see disordered eating. So sports like basketball, football, tennis, sports where weight is a variable, but it's not necessarily the main one, or even one of the top five, right? It's things like power, strength, explosive power, skill, right? So weight is one variable, but not necessarily a major one. But even in these sports, we see individuals demonstrate eating disorders and disordered eating, and weight becomes overemphasized. And of course, if it happens less in these sports, there's greater stigma, there's more shame, there's more embarrassment, and that also has long-term impact on our athletes. Let's look a little bit at the wider consequences of disordered eating in athletes. So, because it's a physical illness, it's a mental illness with a physical manifestation, we often get obsessed with those specific physical characteristics, like weight loss, for example. That's graphic and visible. But there's a wider burden for athletes also that go along with disordered eating and eating disorders. One of the cruelest consequences is athletes get better. Right? So what we see is, in the early stages of disordered eating, is a performance improvement. And what that does cruelly, is reinforce those behaviours. It strengthens that belief that what I'm doing is the right thing, what I'm doing is helping me, what I'm doing is what I need to achieve my goal. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember, is that when those initial beliefs and behaviours are being internalised, it's through that improvement in performance. There's also a generic mental exhaustion. So we can't avoid food. We eat 3-4 meals a day. Athletes often have to fuel more than the rest of us. So eating and nutrition is an important part of that, as Andrew will go on to discuss. But if you're counting calories and you're feeling guilty about food, you can't escape that. So there's a mental exhaustion that goes on. I often ask coaches to say, okay, well, what is your athlete not thinking about when they're obsessing about food? So we often think about what athletes are obsessing about, but what are they missing? So they're not thinking about their friends, they're not thinking about their girlfriend or boyfriend, they're not thinking about tactics, strategy, they're not thinking about their schoolwork, they're not thinking about fun things, their family, holidays. So this obsession takes away from other elements of life. There's a stigma and a burden of secrecy. So athletes don't want to let their coaches know, they don't want to let their friends know. They feel that their mental struggles are a burden to others. So actually having to lie is really difficult to the athletes I've spoke to. They really struggle with that. I'm a truthful person, but I can't tell the truth about this. And that burden is, again, something that we forget about and leads to these relationship struggles. Like any mental illness, there are often other mental illnesses that go with it, what we call comorbidities. And with things like disordered eating and eating disorders, we see elevated levels of low mood, depression, and things like anxiety. We mentioned the performance improvement at the beginning, which is a cruel way it reinforces these behaviours. But ultimately what we see is performance decrement, athletes not finishing races, athletes getting injured in ways that we wouldn't expect for their age, things like bone fractures that aren't necessarily the result of impact. So we do eventually see kind of performance gradually increase in the early stages, but then there's a cliff drop. And athletes either stop competing or are injured and need to get better. In some of my early work, very early work, looking at interviewing athletes and speaking to athletes about these things and how they feel and their relationship with food, one of the interesting, it's all seemed irrational, didn't make sense. Why would you think that? Some people I've taught here, over the years, people who have a good education of nutrition and its importance, right? They've studied this, okay? And you look at some of the behaviours and attitudes and beliefs that they adopt, and you think, well, this is irrational. And I've even used that term in my writing, which my argument today, as I move on, is to think, well, is it actually irrational? So, seeing the body as larger than it objectively is, okay? To all intents and purposes, you're a really fit person, fitter than, top 5% fitness in terms of functional fitness. You shouldn't see your body in the way you do. Weighing yourself multiple times a day, perhaps after meals, doesn't make sense, right? You're not going to change. Your weight won't fluctuate that much. Exercising beyond a schedule. You've got a tightly coordinated, planned schedule, training schedule, planned by experts. Why would you go beyond that schedule, right? Doesn't make sense. Believing food consumed is visible to the naked eye. So I've spoken to athletes who think if they've had a snack or a Mars bar, you can see that with the naked eye, literally on them. Okay, again, doesn't make sense. And then, not eating despite knowing the importance of fuel. So irrational thoughts, and it focuses on what people are thinking and fixing that athlete. Stop thinking like that, right? Stop that irrational thought and reprogram yourself to know that fuel is important. Train yourself to realise that your body is fine. You're not fat, right? So all our efforts focus on the individual, okay? Now, when we move to look at the influence of competitive sport culture, My argument is that actually some of these thoughts might not be as irrational as we think. So the first thing is, if you think your body is fat, well, when your point of comparison is the best athletes in the world, okay, the bar's been raised. So this is a study from an Olympian. In sport, you're so conscious of being in shape because obviously you're surrounded by athletes that are also in shape. If they look better than you or have that edge on you, it's like, oh, I need to do something about it. So athletes are constantly comparing themselves against each other, not against the general population. So that body consciousness is from an elevated plane, if you like. It's very difficult to pinpoint any one cause of any mental illness, including eating disorders, right? It's always multifactorial and a combination of environment and critical events, personality. It's always various things that come into play at a particular time. But for athletes, one of the most pertinent and most regular things that comes up is that athletes talk about coach comments. Coaches are their heroes. Coaches are people they've looked up to. Coaches have a huge role in helping them get to achieve their dreams. So when a coach is making comments, this is an extreme example here, let's read it. The coach comment about being fat really affected me. But I still wanted to be a good swimmer, so I think I probably subconsciously decided, right, I'll show you. Well, I didn't really know what I was doing. I started by starving myself. To me, a diet was not eating. This athlete equated their eating disorder. She went on to develop bulimia nervosa with a coach comment about being fat. It's an extreme example, but even throwaway coach comments, low-level banter about how someone might look or what they might weigh can have an effect. And just because it's water off a duck's back for 8, 9, 10 athletes, there might be 1 or 2 athletes who take that really personally and then go and adopt these disordered behaviours. Okay, so we need to be really careful about that. This is one of my favourite studies, actually, by Suzanne Kosh. It's not been especially well cited, but it is a study I really like. And what happened in this study was they looked at exercise physiologists taking skin caliper and skin fold measurements in the Australian Institute of Sport. And skin fold measurements are a fairly crude measure of fat. You kind of, it's like pinching more. We're the physiologists. Lewis, Christopher. Is it crude? It's fairly crude, isn't it? Are you all right? Depends who's taking it, right? Depends who's taking the measure. Okay. So, I mean, if it depends who's taking these. We'd expect these to be able to take them well, because they're at the Australian Institute of Sport. And it's a range of athletes took part in this. And what they did was they put a voice recorder in the middle of the feedback session to get the scores of their fat test, right? Their skin caliper test. So this is a little bit of the transcript. Do you want to know your total now? Oh, I don't know. It's a bit scary. Well, it's up to you. I mean, this is like getting going for their results for an illness diagnosis or something. Yeah. You sure? Yeah, so I can see where I'm up to. Oh, God. So last time your total was, it was really high. It was like something like 145. Okay, 134.5 today. Athlete says, good. Exercise physiologist says, good change. So not just calm yourself a little bit. It's not necessarily good object overall. It's a good change. And if you read this paper, there are lots of different examples of how this was built up into a big thing, how this was fed back to athletes, and they were constantly asked, do you want this now? Are you ready for this news now, or should I give it you later? And losses in weight were always reinforced as positive, and always said, keep going, keep it up. Where we keep going to is never clear, right? And when is enough is never clear. Just keep that up. Okay, and there are other examples like this in the culture of elite and competitive sport. Regular public weigh-ins, weighing athletes, putting young athletes on dietary and nutrition plans, or telling them to lose weight, worse, without a nutritional plan. So there's a whole emphasis on weight loss, how the body looks. So when you put it in that context, you say, well, how irrational is it? How irrational is it for athletes to start their dietary behaviour, to start weighing themselves on a regular basis? Because they've been weighed for a very young age on a regular basis in their sport. So we need to question whether we do need to go fixing our athletes and whether it's actually the sport environment that we need to fix. So in conclusion, athletes often exhibit disordered eating with consequences for physical and mental health. You have the disorder, but also a generic impact on mental health. What might seemingly be an irrational thought and behaviour, and again I was guilty of calling it that earlier in my career, it can be considered totally rational within the context of certain damaging athletic cultures and practices. So to make things better, I think the priority is to change some of those practices within elite sport, rather than go in trying to fix our disordered, irrational athletes. That's it from me. Thanks very much. I'll pass you over to
So some incredible content and a huge breadth there that we could probably spend hours going back and forward on, and just with the nature of time, we've picked a really small, slim section of the nutrition applied piece. I think I'd probably frame this with there's an awful lot there around self-perception and thoughts and things around that potentially are outside the scope of a nutritionist, but would definitely play into our role within an interdisciplinary team. Just to kind of frame, we're going to move from a bit of that theory into the practice. I've just put this image up because despite the fact that we do see higher prevalence in reporting in linear and power to weight ratio potentially sports, we are seeing in the applied setting it across all sports. And we're seeing it from junior all the way through to elite. And again, it's not dependent on how high we believe performance gets to. So elite in our world might look like Olympic Games, but in reality, someone's elite might be they're 16 years old and this is their last competition ever, and that's their moment of elite performance. And I think we just need to consider where in their life journey they are. But I think what continues to be the case, and despite the research and the ever-growing conversations that are happening, we are still afraid to talk about this topic. We are often afraid to shine a light on it, and I think we have to continue to do that. We have to continue that work. We have to normalise it to make it okay that somebody says they're not okay and that they need help, and that we can effectively and support our athletes and our young people to move through this. So with that in mind, Anthony kindly put up a colour earlier, so I've just slightly expanded on it. And this is something we've used a lot in the applied space and probably gone from what we would describe in the literature and some pieces that we've seen around normal relationships with food through to disordered eating and then eating disorders. And it's a very crude way of kind of bucketing a few bits and pieces up. But I think what this showcases is it's not black and white. We aren't moving from one end of the spectrum and jumping directly to the other. And certainly I'd pose the question of does normal exist? So we talked about potentially a change in body shape and size. Beach ready is often a conversation that's had as we approach summer holidays. We think of moments in time around honeymoons and weddings and things like that. But I think there's often occasions where every single person in this room at some point will have thought, well, I've missed a meal, I've got to eat now. Or I eat my breakfast at 7 and my lunch at 12 and my dinner at 6 and I'm within an hour. And that's eating on a fixed time frame, whether we like it or not, or whether we admit it or not. And so it's becoming hard to distinguish, because there isn't a clinical diagnosis, where there are in some instances there around an eating disorder, is when is someone not okay? And which of these things are we seeing in a space where actually it's something that we want to raise awareness to? And Anthony correctly points out, as a nutritionist, I'm asking people to do some of these things. I am absolutely asking people to eat on a schedule in advance of a training session, in advance of a competition. I am absolutely asking them to be aware of calories or specific nutrients. If we're talking about fueling for the weight required, we are scheduling carbohydrates around training for a performance impact. We are absolutely looking at the idea of a rapid weight change potentially in a combat sport. If we're making weight for someone who's a cruiserweight or a boxer who's moving down through, they might sit anywhere up to 10% at the starter camp to where they end up on weigh scales. So we are asking people to do these things. And the challenge for us then is, when is that too far and when are we not balanced? So if we're asking an athlete to do this throughout the year, on a Sunday on their rest day, can they be off the time frame? Can they go and have a meal that isn't necessarily perfect in their eyes? Can they go out with their friends? How many times do we get towards Christmas and we're having conversations with athletes that actually, I probably can't have Christmas dinner, can I? It is a roast dinner. It is carbs, colour and protein. There is absolutely nothing wrong with it. You know, we've got athletes that at times will not have a piece of birthday cake on their birthday when it's nowhere near a peak performance in their competition schedule. So I think some of this is trying to frame where is that scale and where are we creeping along? When is it okay and when is it maybe not? Before we get anywhere near the eating disorder section of this. And I think on the point at the end there around some of our data and some of the way that we interrogate that, I do think we do need to do a better job in sport. I do think we need to do a better job of not causing it to be a causal relationship when we present data, when we see performance on one axis and weight on another axis and it's a linear graph. I really do find it hard to believe that it is linear and it is one single axis against one single axis. What was the training cycle like? What was their life like? What was stress like outside of it? What was their adaptation curve like? What were all the other metrics that come around a performance like? And if it's a win and loss, what did the opponent do? So there's lots of other things we just need to be really conscious of in this space. So I think it's making sure we don't black and white scale it. And one of the things that we often should be looking at in this, in my opinion, is the idea of how do we make our environment safer? So we talked about some comments and some throwaway moments. And for me, just framing body neutral language and food neutral language is probably where we've started to move a little bit more, and certainly working with everyone within the interdisciplinary team and the surrounding team. So teachers, parents, house parents, carers, that kind of group around what are we talking about with this? So how do we take morality out of what we look like? And we do it so incidentally in culture, and we do it so often, and we sometimes do it with the best intentions. So you look great, you've lost a bit of weight. Well, if I'm an athlete that might be the case for, I have that reiterated. It's the same as I run a little faster, it's reiterated, so lighter must be better. I look good now, I must lose more, so I will look better. And it can be a really slippery slope. Whereas actually just considering the fact that you think you're doing something nice, is that the right thing to say? Is it something that we should be intentfully saying? And intent around language, again, it's really hard in the sport history and the culture of where we've come from. So we hear a lot of, we come back from out of season and off season and we're out of shape. What are we talking about here? What is our intent of language? What do we actually mean? Do we mean we're aerobically less fit? Do we mean we're less strong? Do we mean we've had a shape and size change, but does it really matter? You've seen someone at their peak of their career in their last race of the year. They've then had 3 to 4 weeks off and returned. Of course, they look slightly different. This is no longer the end of season. This is the start of potentially a 44-week season. We've got a long way to go before we've got to peak again. And so just being really conscious of body neutrality and the language we use and things that peers to peers will use, and cultural language in sport, things like swimmers will often talk about being heavy in the water. What they mean is they've got a low floating position or they feel tired and fatigued, but they're making a comment that is related to a weight metric, and someone in the pool relates that to their shape and size. So we shouldn't be using that in a peer-to-peer environment, in my opinion. And certainly coaches and support staff, we need to be really conscious of it. And then food neutral language is just the idea of just trying to remove judgment of morality around food. So trying to get away from it's healthy or unhealthy, it's good or it's bad. When is it good or when is it bad? Do I want an elite athlete at the Olympics and Paralympic Games stood in the core room eating a piece of chocolate cake? Probably not. But if it's in their off season, if it's on a weekend, if it's a social event, if it's a normal training day but there's no pressure on it, is that okay? Yeah, it probably is, in moderation, with a whole load of framing around it. But it's really important that we consider how we talk about food, whether we attach things to it. We certainly shouldn't be using food as a punishment. We certainly shouldn't be using food as a reward. And I certainly think some of the idea of we're tricking our athletes into certain things is really quite challenging, and it still continues to exist in sport, and it shouldn't, in my opinion. So putting chocolate cake on the dining room to see who eats it and then giving them laps if they do eat it is just not okay. And we have to move through that. So just kind of shifting gears ever so slightly before we hand over to Rebekah, just a lot of conversation's been going on recently, and the prevalence of REDS has definitely come through, and the discussions around REDS has definitely come through. But when we move more to a diagnostic and how do we identify individuals in this space, I think REDS has been put in the same bucket a lot of the time as eating disorders and disordered eating. And I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive, but there are times when one will exist without the other, especially when we consider that of these 8 eating disorders, 3 can be clinically diagnosed, but only 3 of them are a low weight eating disorder. So you can absolutely not be in REDS and have one of the other 5. When we talk about REDS, we talk about intentional restriction and unintentional restriction. So we're making a choice or not making a choice to restrict energy. And so what we look at in sport is how often are we talking about being in disordered eating and eating disorders when we're in a sport setting? So we talked about some of these scenarios before, but just to reiterate them, I may have low energy availability that is intentful, but I'm making weight for a boxing competition, or I'm making a weight class category, so I am intentionally restricting. I am in low energy availability. I have a purpose and a point. When I finish that event, can I come back away from that? Can I go back to what we would describe as more normal patterns of eating, more normal attitudes towards food? We talk a little bit around low energy availability and not having an eating disorder or disordered eating because of a lack of understanding. So we have a fueling mismatch. We've changed clubs. We've gone through a transition from school to college to university, and training dynamics have changed. Sports might have changed. We may be just simply not matching effectively. We might know what carbohydrates they are, but we might not know how much is effective. And then certainly just kind of moving through some of those conversations is really, really important, that the amount of energy you need to be healthy in the REDS model is over 45 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. It's a large amount of energy. So for someone who's 80 kilos of lean mass, 100 kilos, just for my own personal ease of maths, we're looking at a resting energy intake without any exercise or activity on that day of 3,600 calories. To be diagnosed as having REDS and the low energy availability, along with a myriad of other symptoms, you have to be under 30. So you're at 2,600 calories. To be lower down in the eating disorder, anorexia, restriction kind of banding, you're anywhere below 10. 20 is the upper limit of that banding. That's 1,500 calories. The difference between 1,500 and 3,600 is massive. So I think it's really important that we identify both of these are a thing. Sometimes they're linked, but sometimes they're not. People can exist somewhere in the blurred area in between. So then when we talk about what are we looking for me, there's a lot in this, and there's a lot to unpack, and every single human is an individual within this space. If we took 2 athletes, I could see the same behaviors from one who is incredibly diligent, counts his calories, makes sure he eats on the right time schedule, and is absolutely fine on a Sunday to go to Five Guys and have a burger with no stress whatsoever. I could see another athlete with none of those things in place, but suddenly starts being really regular, really consistent with timings, but won't have anything that they don't deem to be the right foods, whatever their version of that is. So it's a behavior change that we're sometimes looking for. It's looking for things like trends and how are things changing for them. Are they having a change in social environment? Do they start eating in different places, maybe not with their friends, not in public environments? Are they having extra training, extra food, limiting different pieces? Are they having a change in cleanliness or change in clothing and appearance? How are some of those other things affecting things? And also, for me particularly, just something to also consider in this is how is neurodiversity and other factors within their lifestyle and them as a human being also going to play into some of this? So the challenge with some of this, and the reason that some of the research is quite vague, is it's really hard to classify these things. We don't have a black and white, you have it or you don't have it. And so one of the things that is really, really important is, it doesn't matter who's in our environment with our athletes, is if it's a parent and an athlete, or a parent coach and an athlete, or it's something like some of our environments in professional sport and some of our environments here where you've got 18 to 20 practitioners and coaches sat around a table, is we have to start sharing information. Because little Billy might walk up to the head coach and say, oh, I kind of feel a bit tired on a Monday, and might let me know that they felt a bit stressed about having something yesterday to eat, or they might let another athlete, another coach know that, or another assistant or an S&C coach know that actually went for an extra run tomorrow. And in isolation, there's nothing really particularly red flaggy about that. It's not something that's going to drive me to something, but put them all together and I'm a little bit aware of it. And it's something that we want to have a conversation about and explore. And we want to possibly consider whether there's some resources or some support that we might want to put in place before we continue to have those things exacerbate and potentially, again, we're not going to necessarily stop them, but we are potentially going to raise awareness, provide some support and help, and just have that acknowledgement that it is going on
for them. And ARFID's very good at telling everyone lots of little bits. We have to start putting those things together and communicating, and not just assuming that it's just a throwaway comment that we can go through. With that, I'm going to hand over to tech support and Rebekah.
There we go. Should be ready whenever you are, Rebekah.
Hello, I'm hoping you can hear me and that you can see the slides that I've got up as well. So if you can't at any point, please do just shout and we can try and fix it. So yeah, hi, I am Rebekah, and thank you so much for inviting me along today. So I work with the charity First Steps ED, and I am the EDIS service coordinator, which is basically a fancy way of saying I oversee the work that we do in different universities, and I also support people that are struggling with their relationship with food, eating, body image. And today I am going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of who First Steps ED is, the services we provide, and how you can signpost or refer yourself in if you feel that you yourself are struggling, or you feel you know somebody who might be struggling with their eating. So first of all, who are we? Well, we are a specialist eating disorder charity, and we support both those with diagnosed eating disorders, but also people experiencing disordered eating. So you do not need a diagnosis to access our support. So within Leicestershire, we are able to support those up to the age of 25 years old. And for those older than that, or for those who don't perhaps fall in our commissioned areas, we do have private practice support options as well. So originally we started in Derbyshire as a self-help group, and that is still our main base. But over the years we have grown, we are ever expanding. We're trying to get into as many areas as possible. And many of our services are now commissioned across the Midlands, and we also have some funding in Hertfordshire as well. That means we're able to support down there too. We are an NHS linked charity as well, so we work really closely with clinical services like CAMS ED for children and young people, and also adult eating disorder and community eating disorder services too. And there are times where if somebody is referred through to us and we feel actually maybe you're a bit too severe for us, or we're not quite the right level of care for you, we can step them up into NHS eating disorder services, and then the other can happen as well. If they've perhaps finished some more intensive care with somebody, they can step them down to us for some more relapse prevention work as well. And a lot of our team as well, both volunteers and staff, have lived experience of eating disorders as well and are fully recovered. So it really gives us that extra layer of empathy in the work that we do, mean that we can really relate to the struggles that people bring to us in our support. So moving on to support options that we have. One-to-one support is one of the main options of support that we offer. So it's not a counselling service, but it's a form of specialised peer support. And these sessions take place between the service user and the specialist support officer, either virtually via Microsoft Teams, or we do have some in-person availability. It does depend on location. We have a main office in Derby where we facilitate face-to-face sessions, and we are starting to do our absolute best to get out into schools to deliver face-to-face sessions in schools as well. So as I said, it is 10 sessions in total, and we do have a nutritional therapist team as well. So there are options to kind of swap out sessions with your support officer to have some nutrition sessions as well. And within these sessions, we really are service user led. So we recognise that actually empowering people to take control and power over their recovery is a really effective way of working, and kind of forcing support when somebody perhaps isn't ready can be really detrimental. So we're really guided by service users in terms of what they would like to work on. So areas that we commonly cover include body image, self-esteem, anxiety. We do tend to do a fair bit of work on excessive exercise as well, because that's something that we're seeing quite a lot of, especially since lockdown has come around and the online workouts have become quite a big thing. And we also liaise very closely with other professionals throughout this support as well, as I said earlier, like CAMS, GPs, social care as well where appropriate. But yeah, it is very service user led, and as I said, in Leicestershire we are funded to provide this support to those up to the age of 25. Within Leicestershire as well, we are able to offer CBTE support. So this is something that is targeted towards people who are maybe showing a more moderate to severe presentation. So it's having more of an impact on their physical health those who are underweight and who are maybe losing weight as well. So normally we get referrals for CBTE directly from NHS teams, but obviously if we were to assess somebody and think CBTE would be the better route here, we would offer it there. And we are liaising very, very closely with clinical teams when we provide this support. And it is available for those aged 14 and over, and the length of support kind of varies depending on service user needs as well. So between 20 and 40 sessions normally. We do also run various online workshops. So I've kind of listed all of them. I'm not going to go through all of them in great detail, but I will pick out a few different ones. So our binge eating, ARFID, body image and wellbeing workshop are all kind of, and I'd Finding Peace with Food workshop as well, are all closed groups. So they run over 4 weeks in total, one evening a week for 4 weeks. And they're kind of specialised to the different struggles that people are experiencing. And we kind of, some of them, like the wellbeing workshop, is just for CYPs, so children and young people up to the age of 17. And then the rest of them, we kind of split them. So we have children and young people and then older age brackets as well. I'd really like to bring attention to the EDIS support group. So that is a support group which is free to access for any university students across the UK, and it is a drop-in group as well. So we kind of ask students what they would like us to work on, and then we tailor the workshop to meet their needs too. So areas that we cover include like comparisons, excessive exercise. We have a lot of like Christmas and like summer themes as well, because they can often be really, really challenging. Like we were saying earlier, when people are thinking, oh, I've got to get Beachbody ready for the summer, or feeling really conscious of what you're eating over Christmas time. So we try and kind of make sure we slip those ones in at the appropriate times of year. Our Pips Place Next Steps workshop is also available free of charge across the country. And that is a guided self-help group to support those with long-standing eating disorders, or for those who have been stepped down or discharged from more specialist clinical care. And again, that is a drop-in group where the topics change each week according to what people in the group want to see and what feels like it will be most helpful. We also run school workshops too. So this is where we will go into a primary or secondary school, and we're really aiming to provide that early intervention work and kind of raising awareness around body image struggles, self-esteem and social media, especially because that is a massive factor in many eating disorders and disordered eating struggles. So it is a 45-minute workshop, and we do hang around for 15-20 minutes afterwards to provide that aftercare, because we are aware that we're talking about a lot of quite triggering topics. So we don't want to just leave you to deal with that. We will hang around afterwards to support with that and help, because we know it can be very sensitive, some of the things that we cover. And we also have befriending. So this is again free across the UK, though for video befriending, we do ask for a small initial donation just to help with admin fees. And it is regular emails or video calls with one of our volunteer befrienders. Now, as I said earlier, a lot of our volunteer befrienders have lived experience either of supporting a loved one with an eating disorder, so from that parent carer perspective, or from personally experiencing an eating disorder as well. And we spend a lot of time matching service users up with befrienders, making sure that they have similar experiences and similar interests, so that that rapport will be there. And it can be used by both parents and carers, as well as those personally struggling. And it lasts up to 6 months. And if actually it's deemed that it's going really well and it will be appropriate, there is an option to extend it up to 9 months as well. So it's a bit of a longer term, less intensive form of support. And finally, we've got our Skills for Carers workshop. So this is a 3-week workshop in total, so 1 evening a week for 3 weeks, designed for parents, carers and older siblings. And the aim is really to support them in supporting their loved ones, and to give them a space as well for support themselves, because caring for somebody struggling with an eating disorder is a massive thing. And this workshop is very practical, so it has lots of tips and practical advice and case studies to help develop those skills of support. So if you've listened to that and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I know somebody who might benefit, or who might or maybe yourself, you're thinking, oh, that sounds quite useful, you can go onto our website, and in the top right hand corner there is a referral button. You can click that and it will take you through to our referral page, where there's just some general FAQs, and then the make a referral button takes you through to our referral form. So we accept referrals from anybody. As I said, we're not commissioned everywhere within the UK. We are only commissioned in certain areas, but we do have private practice options. So yeah, you can have self-referrals. We also often receive referrals from parents or carers and friends, and professional referrals from like GPs, school teachers, university staff, that kind of thing too. And we aim for a 10-day turnaround from when you make the referral in to us then contacting you to book in an initial assessment. As I said earlier, at First Steps, we're not clinical, so we don't make diagnoses and we don't offer physical health monitoring as part of the support that we provide. So we always recommend it's a good idea to go to your GP and let them know that you're thinking of referring into us, and maybe asking for some physical monitoring, because then they can monitor the physical health side of things while we focus more on the emotional well-being side of things. And there's also lots of other forms of support as well available across the UK. So BEAT is another eating disorder charity. They have a helpline that you can ring if you're kind of struggling, or someone you know is struggling and you're not too sure what to do or where to go with it. And they also run various support groups. ARFID Awareness UK is really great. So ARFID is an eating disorder that is becoming more well known about, and it stands for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So it affects people on a more sensory level in terms of like struggling with the way food tastes, the way it, like the textures of it, as well as the like fear of choking or being sick or being unwell after eating. So we do support with ARFID at First Steps ED, but ARFID Awareness UK, the organisation, has some really good resources on their website. And as I said before as well, going to your GP is always a good shout too, because they might be aware of more local services to you too. So thank you. I'm aware I have just shared a lot of information, but thank you so much for listening. I've popped our general contact details here. You've got our general email, my email, and then my colleague Anissa's email as well. She oversees all of the work that we do in Leicestershire. So please do get in touch if there are any questions that you have or anything like that. Yeah, thank you.